looks like, we can start with a great image here of Chicago, the windy city. It's more like the foggy city, right? So this is, of course, Chicago. It's a great image of buildings from the 1920s. So that's what we're talking about here, this exhibit, the High Rises project. The real heart of it is the Art Deco era, which is a very brief time and a really energetic and important creative time for skyscrapers, the 1920s, the era of Art Deco. And you can see half a dozen 1920 skyscrapers there on the screen. Of course, you've got 333 North Michigan next to us, and the Tribune Tower, and behind it, the Medina Athletic Club. You can see the Wrigley Building. You can see the London Guarantee, and off in the distance, you have the Palmolive Building. And so I wanted to show you another view of these skyscrapers up from the clouds that's also kind of dear to a lot of Chicagoans' hearts. But I need to go this way. And that is, of course, Jesus Christ looking down on the city of Chicago from the clouds. Actually, you can see a couple extra bonus skyscrapers from the 1920s in that building. Does anyone recognize in the center there? Well, off to the right, I mean, the ones we saw before in the center, off to the right is, thank you, the Jewelers Building, and of course, Carbide and Carbon there on the far end of it. Does anyone know where this is, by the way? It's in the church, right? It's in the Skyscraper Church. The Chicago Temple, as they call it. It's the Sky Chapel up there near the very top. And I think that's just wonderful. It's perfect. Chicago has a skyscraper church. I mean, what other city? 568 feet tall? I mean, that's naturally where a skyscraper church should be here in Chicago. Who could ever object to that, right? One person in particular could object to that. That's Colonel McCormick, the publisher of the Chicago Tribune. Now, what's his problem with this skyscraper church? Well, I'll tell you. Colonel McCormick had just finished an international contest. The minute they announced that skyscraper church, he had just had a $100,000 contest with architects, hundreds of them from around the world, trying to design for McCormick the most beautiful skyscraper in the world to be the new headquarters of the Chicago Tribune. And he'd picked a winner. And every single one of these entrants had followed the rules that said Chicago has a 400-foot tall height limit. And he picked his winner. You see it right there in the center. It's based on a French cathedral. It's by Howells and Hood. And that skyscraper is just under 400 feet tall. And now the city council is going to allow a church to have a 568-foot tall skyscraper a couple months after he made this announcement. So you can imagine the Chicago Tribune was really cool about this. So they immediately, there's the headline, the Methodists have found a way to break through the 400-foot crust that is stifling Chicago architecture. And rather than go on a full rant, the story actually says, we thank these Methodists for their contribution to greatness. And now, having made this decision, we think it's only fair that we've gone back to our winning architects and asked them if they would redesign the Chicago Tribune Tower to be the same height as the church, which is the middle illustration, or perhaps even more tall, probably is. What if we just blew the lid off of it? And so that's the last entry. So, and then there's a thinly veiled threat of legal action in the text. And so anyway, of course, the city saw the error of its ways, and soon the height limit was no more. And the Chicago Tribune Tower added another 4 stories, though. It did not get to that extreme that you see at the far right there. But what's this about height limits in Chicago? I mean, you guys, you're the city of skyscrapers. You had skyscrapers long before you had cars. That's State Street in 1902. Right? Does anyone recognize the building with all the tall columns? Everyone knows that, right? That's Marshall Field. It's when it's brand new, by the way. And that's by the great Daniel Burnham, the Chicago skyscraper architect par excellence, I might say. And next to it, though, with the big arch, anyone know what that one is? That's, the Masonic Temple. So this is also by Burnham and his partner, John Root. And this is a picture of it. You could see it there on the side next to the New York World Building in Manhattan. And those are the two tallest skyscrapers in the world, circa 1892. And it's kind of funny because the New York World Building is about 6 feet taller if you count the top of the lantern, but if you count the highest floor, it's the Chicago, Masonic Temple, which is an argument that I think still continues to this day of which city has the tallest skyscraper. Well, the Sears Tower has a higher roof. I mean, whatever they're calling it today. I still call it the Sears Tower. Or, but the one in New York has a spire that's taller, and we're going to count its spire, but we can't talk about the antenna on the Sears Tower, Willis Tower, because Dan Safaric here from the Council of Tall Buildings knows about these rules. So this argument persists to this day. But Chicago, the Windy City, certainly does not lack confidence about having the tallest buildings. This is one of my favorite headlines from 1891. Chicago's big buildings, one of the many things at which we beat the world. So it shows, of course, you can see behind me, the Masonic Temple and another great Burnham building, Burnham and Root building, which is that Monadnock building. And that's in the illustration on the right. And it's got one of my favorite illustrations I've seen. So this is just trying to help people understand how big skyscrapers are. It says, how it might be if 6,000 people in the Monadnock building should leave at one time. And take a look. They would apparently leave in a massive cube and stand on the roadway. But the point is that these skyscrapers just blew people's minds. It's hard to get our heads around how big of a deal it was that suddenly, instead of 3, 4, 5-story tall buildings, we had elevators now and construction methods that allowed us to build buildings 16, 18, 20, 30, keep going, stories into the sky. And I mean, Daniel Burnham took that fame from the Monadnock and from his Masonic Temple and got asked to do, of course, the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. You see there, that's the manufacturer's building with its great iron or steel trusses, the biggest building in the world, despite the fact that it's temporary. You can see it right there in the middle of the White City, as they called it. And I particularly love this bird's eye view illustration of the White City because as a Pittsburgher, it also shows, as a Pittsburgher, I love the other wonder of the World's Fair, which is the Ferris wheel. And that was designed by a Pittsburgh bridge engineer, George Ferris. And so Pittsburgh has that connection to Chicago. And frankly, Pittsburgh has another connection to Daniel Burnham. And that is that we have more skyscrapers by Daniel Burnham in our city than any other city outside of Chicago. And in fact, we have the tallest skyscraper that Daniel Burnham ever designed, 350-foot tall Oliver Building. It's taller than any of his Chicago buildings. And that gets us back to that height limit, because Pittsburgh didn't have a height limit, but Chicago did. And why? You guys were the masters of skyscrapers. But what happened? Well, the same year as that World's Fair, there was also a Great Depression. And it wrecked the economy, and it wrecked downtown real estate. And Chicago, which now is filled with a glut of super tall office buildings, can't fill them up. And this is crashing commercial real estate values. And so the city council said, we need to stop with these skyscrapers. And they passed a height limit in 1893 of 130 feet. Now that Masonic Temple behind me is, what, 290? I think it's close to 300 feet. I just forgot how tall it is. But that's half of the height of that building. So Chicago put this draconian height limit in, and it changed, it adapted over the years a little bit to the point by 1920 it was 400 feet, not 130. But still, it was 260 feet for the main part of the building, and then 140 feet for an ornamental tower, basically. And this is the first building. This is the first building that was built under those regulations. The Monument to Spearmint. So the Wrigley Building. And I love this. I especially love Chris's illustration of this because it gives you a good look at that very the French Renaissance style. It's very froofy, I guess my niece would say. It's a froofy style. It's very, it doesn't look very modern. And in fact, what I'd say about it is it looks very New York-y. Sorry if I've offended anyone. But it looks like a New York skyscraper of the time because that first picture on the left is a famous illustration from 1908 about what does the future hold for our cities. What will our cities look like? And you can see it is a lot of Wrigley buildings. And what I think is especially funny is that the building on the right is from my antique postcard collection, and it's an updated version that came out several years later. It was mailed in 1921, you can see on the postmark. And so that's the same year the Wrigley building opens, right? And they've changed their view of what the future holds, but not of buildings, really. It's what's going to be flying over them. So instead of airships and blimps, we're now going to have airplanes to fly us to the Panama Canal, which is what these things all say on the side. Panama Canal, big trip to the Panama Canal. So this is the kind of buildings that people were still expecting the future held for their cities. And in New York, they were not big, giant fans of these buildings either. There was a lot of pressure for height limits there too. And I must read this quote. Are American cities going mad architecturally? This is a 1911 article in the New York Times. And the person there who's declaiming American skyscraper madness is none other than Ernest Flagg, who was the architect of the Singer Building, which in 1908 opened on Broadway as the tallest skyscraper in the world. So the architect of America's and the world's tallest skyscraper is saying this about skyscrapers: I am opposed to high commercial buildings. I think it was a great mistake to have ever allowed them to be built. They disfigure the city and they shut out the light. They dwarf into insignificance all the other buildings of the town. I regard the whole thing as an ill-advised experiment which could only have been carried out in a place where public taste was at a low ebb and where dollars outweighed all aesthetic considerations. Says the man who made our tallest skyscraper. So skyscrapers did not have universal appeal even then. So when people get angry about the new tall ones now, just keep in mind this is not a new problem. Well, as I said, Chicago did get rid of its height limits. And so one of the first ones that the new limit was you could have as tall of a tower as you wanted as long as it was as narrow as no bigger than 1/4 the size of the lot. So this is Alonzo Mather, and this is his Mather Tower. The last name Alonzo Mather rings a bell. He's a direct descendant of Cotton Mather, who's the thundering preacher from New England. But anyway, he made all his money not by preaching, but by inventing a rail car that was more humane for transporting cattle to the stockyards. And so he won a medal from the American Humane Society for his invention. And this building, although it's tall and skinny, looks pretty old-fashioned still. It's kind of a Gothic look, like the Tribune Tower. I will say, incidentally, it has a lot of steps. I can say from experience, because when Chris and I visited here a couple years ago, we wanted to make sure we knew how tall it was and where all the stories were for the annotations that are in our book. And so, yeah, there's no picture of me on these steps because that's a mercy to you folks. But yeah, it's a long walk up. That contest, the Trib contest, also gave more prominence to some very new modern ideas about skyscrapers. These are some of the entries, most of them from European architects who didn't have their own skyscrapers but had ideas about them. And on the left is one by Ailill Saarinen, who was a Finnish architect. And although it was never built, it is seen by many people as the prototype of Art Deco skyscrapers. It won second place in the contest. It was widely publicized. And it is seen, like I said, as a model. It was an inspiration for architects. It was an inspiration for Raymond Hood, who won the Tribune contest, because his next building that he did was in New York City. And that's a picture of it. And it is the American Radiator Building. And he himself said that he had the designs of Ailill Saarinen's building in his studio as he was designing this building. And it was such a sensation in 1924 when it opened that Georgia O'Keeffe there painted it. And if you like, you can go over to the Art Institute, as I'm going to tomorrow, and look at that very canvas. I think I've found, actually, the closest approximation to Saarinen's proposed skyscraper, and that's in Houston. This is the Gulf Building headquarters in Houston, Texas. If you look, those strong verticals, the arched windows, the projections, it's kind of a dead ringer for Saarinen's building. And this was built for and by Jesse Jones. Jesse Jones in Houston was a major developer of real estate. He started out operating a lumber yard, and he got into construction, and then he built some of Texas's first skyscrapers. And you can tell this one was a big deal because they have a Zeppelin and an airplane flying around it, which is apparently how we always signify if a building is important. If you go inside, it's got a fantastic Art Deco interior. That 3-story bank ceiling is one of the best that I think I've seen. And at the far end of it, there is even a stained glass window celebrating the Battle of San Jacinto, which is when Texas got its independence. Bertram Goodhue is a New York architect who also entered the contest, and that's his entry on the left. He didn't win that contest, but he won another contest, which was to design the first skyscraper for a state capitol building, and that's in Lincoln, Nebraska. So you see a man on top, a statue of someone sowing wheat, and these wonderful Indian decorations or native decorations from a Thunderbird design. And if you go inside, it's even more spectacular. This is Hildreth Meyer is the interior designer. She's a muralist who did both the ceilings, which are very colorful, and the floors, which are black and white and look like a graphic novel. And they have, if you look closely, pictures of prehistoric animals. And this is showing the kinds of creatures that science was discovering had existed in Nebraska millions of years ago. So in the midst of a time when science, or rather when there were movements to get this theory of evolution out of schools, I like that Nebraska doubled down on science in this big state cathedral. That's Hildreth Meyer there, obviously. And I think it's also interesting that Eliel Saarinen, who we met earlier, the Finnish architect who came up with that design, he kind of inspired this Nebraska building too, because if you look at it, it bears a striking resemblance to the tower at the Helsinki train station, which is a design by Eliel Saarinen from 1909. So this is how far advanced he was and how influential he was in the Art Deco movement. And if the building on the left didn't get built, at least it kind of did, I think, because I think architects, I'm not an architect, I'm just a writer, so this is all conjecture, but I think they tend to borrow ideas from other architects. So Holabird and Root is a famous firm here in Chicago that did the Chicago Board of Trade there. They also did 333 North Michigan next door. They're both sons of famous architects from Chicago, so as a second generation of them. And I think it's pretty neat that at one time in Chicago, if you wanted to go up high and look at the city, it was at the Chicago Board of Trade. Maybe they'll open that roof up again someday. But I think it's now, as buildings get taller, the observatories get higher and higher up, and the old ones close. Los Angeles has some wonderful Art Deco buildings. This is one of the best. It's one of the most popular images from the collection. It's the blue and gold Eastern Columbia building built for a department store. The person you see there is Adolf Sirati, who is a Jewish immigrant to Los Angeles, and he opened a clock store in downtown. And then that business succeeded, and it grew and grew until he had a beautiful department store. And the way that he always sort of paid tribute to where it came from is these big clock faces on the top of the building that remind him of his clock shop. And if you go on the roof of it, it's now a condo, so it's next to a pool. So if you are a member of the condominium and you want to go swimming, this is how you will know if you waited an hour after eating before you go swimming. And that's me in the center there is a little bit of information about Los Angeles is they really didn't like skyscrapers. So they had a stricter height limit than Chicago did. And most of the buildings are 12 or 13 stories tall up until the 1950s. But you could kind of cheat it a little bit if you put something ornamental on top. So a lot of these towers in Los Angeles are ornamental and empty so they can get around the restrictions. Here's another one called Bullock's Wilshire. It's a department store as well, just like Eastern Columbia. And it's got a remarkable interior. John Bullock was someone who worked in a department store in LA and then went out on his own. And Wilshire is Wilshire Boulevard, the first big street. So this is for people with cars rather than people who rode the streetcar. And it became a very popular store for Hollywood actresses. And One way you know that is by the carving above the door. You can see that the figures on the left look a lot like the Oscar statue, and that's because this building was built the same year as the Oscar statues were introduced, and the guy who designed them also did the carving for this building. It's now a law school, so that is a law library, that center image, which was originally the sportswear department. So that is a painting on the wall that is supposed to represent action and sports. And the elevator door looks like some painting from Vasily Kandinsky. And this is my favorite part of that building. It's the portico. So it's warped because it's so big I had to use my phone's little landscaping feature to scroll across it. But you can see, in Southern California, when there's the heavy rains that always are falling down and ruining people's shopping day, these women could, their chauffeurs could drive them under the portico share, and they could unload their gifts without getting soaked by the California rain. In Chicago, you've got this wonderful, we saw in the first image, the Palmolive building with the beacon on top, which was called for a short time the Lindbergh Beacon, to make sure that airplanes could find their way across Lake Michigan in the time before radar. A lot of these Art Deco buildings have beacons that are advertised at the time as a boon for the aviators themselves. And in the center, the still original carved mahogany wooden doors on the elevators show women. Maybe they have Palmolive soap, or maybe they're just in the jungle bathing, but that's the idea behind those images. And so Palmolive, also to reach out to its female customer base, had hired an opera singer to do the Palmolive radio hour, and they named her Olive Palmer. That's her picture, not her real name. But Olive Palmer was such a popular radio show and helped increase Palmolive sales so much that the other soap companies in Chicago decided they'd start doing radio programming too, which soon came to be known as soap operas. Exactly. This is a story that accompanies one of the largest images in the gallery, so I'll let you check it out yourselves in the gallery. But it's an inspirational story of a woman who designed a skyscraper Chris was mentioning in Tulsa. This is a church skyscraper, and her name is Ada Robinson, and I wanted to point out, especially to you folks, that she was trained. She's a designer. She was an art teacher, and she was trained at the Art Institute of Chicago. So you can take partial credit for this skyscraper in Tulsa. The exhibit is next moving from Chicago to this building in Detroit, the Guardian Building, which is one of the most colorful, most exciting buildings to see. The architect said that he was inspired by Antonin Gaudi, the architect in Barcelona who did the Sagrada Familia. All those bright primary colors. The architect was also assisted by a woman named Mary Chase Stratton. So Mary Chase Stratton was his neighbor next door, and she also ran a pottery business, and so she did all of the architectural clay and pottery for this building's exterior and in the interior, and that's the architect himself, Wirt Rowland, carved by his favorite building sculptor. This is maybe my, I showed you the Masonic Temple, so I wanted to show you, Chicago still gets to have a Masonic Temple. You can't see the original one anymore because it's been removed. It was torn down in the 1930s, but this building was actually designed as an athletic club for the Medina Shriners. So you know the shrine that's now the Bally's Casino. When they wanted to go work out, lift weights, or have a banquet, or have a ball, or just stay in an apartment downtown, they had this skyscraper for themselves. And that's Big Bill Thompson, the mayor, wearing one of their signature red fezzes, breaking ground for it. And of course, the cover image from our book is the Carbide and Carbon building. And it's often said that, well, this was one of the first all-color buildings. It used colorful architectural tile like the ones in Los Angeles. And this building, it's often said that it was designed because it's green with a gold top to look like a champagne bottle. But I have a theory. The main tenant was not Carbide and Carbon, was not Union Carbide Company, rather. It was one of their subsidiaries, which was an acetylene torch manufacturer. So many of the floors of this building were initially occupied, and the building was actually owned by the subsidiary, Oxweld Acetylene Torches. That's one of their advertisements for welding pipelines, welding skyscrapers. So I like to think that that gold thing at the top is not a champagne cork, but it's the flame shooting out of an acetylene welding torch. It's a better beacon than the one they have in Minneapolis. This is the Fauché Tower. It was built by a man named Wilbur Fauché, who a few years after this building went up, went to Leavenworth Prison for defrauding people of all their money to build a skyscraper. That's him there with his business manager just going over some newspaper clippings in their jail cell. But the Fauché still shines over downtown Minneapolis. It's still, well, it's a hotel now, so you can actually go up there and have a drink in his old office. Another sign that shines over downtown is in Philadelphia, where Chris is from, the PSFS building. And I just wanted to wind up with this image because it helps to emphasize how brief this period of great creativity was. This building opened in 1932 in Philadelphia for the Philadelphia Savings Fund Society. So it's a bank headquarters, but it's also the first international style building ever built as an office tower. So it's credited as the first one of this new wave of buildings that was coming, where everything was going to be rectangular. It wasn't going to be stepped in like Art Deco buildings. And it was not going to have beautiful curly cues all over the place or thrusting chrome. It was just going to be shiny and straight and plain. And you can see in the interior, it does show a little bit of the Art Deco's glistening, gleaming surfaces, but it's also simplified very greatly. So this is 1932. There's still Art Deco buildings going up at the time. But of course, then the Great Depression intervened, and then World War II. And then when we came back to building skyscrapers again, Art Deco is firmly out of fashion. So I will show you my last image. It's from my hometown, so I have to show it. But there's another reason. It's the Koppers building. It's the headquarters of a company named Koppers, invented, or rather selling products that were invented by a man named Heinrich Koppers, who figured out how to take all the smoke coming out of coke ovens for making steel and use that smoke to make industrial chemicals. So Andrew Mellon, a Pittsburgh banker, bought that company, moved it to Pittsburgh. He owned a lot of companies. He also owned Gulf Oil, or the controlling share in Gulf Oil. So he built the Gulf Oil building across the street from the Koppers building. You can see them both in this nice postcard from my collection. But in the 1920s, Andrew Mellon was no longer a powerful industrial banker capitalist. He was the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States through the 1920s. And so many people said it was because of his economic policies that we had the Great Depression. So it's kind of maybe Pittsburgh's fault a little bit that we don't have any more Art Deco skyscrapers. But I like to still take people on the tours that I give in Pittsburgh up to the 29th floor balcony of the Koppers building. And I love to tell them all about these stories and share some of the stories from my book, Multi-Stories, my first book, which is about the first skyscrapers in America. And I also give talks to corporations and groups. So please, if you would like to talk to me about that, I'd be happy to give you a card after the show. But I want to mostly invite you to take a look, if you've enjoyed these stories and the stories of the people behind the skyscrapers, take a look at our highrisescollection.com website, where you will find 200 buildings. You can zoom in on every one of them and see all these great details. You can read the stories of each. You can compare how tall they are and see which one wins. You can sift them out and just see all the ones that are in the South, or all the ones from the 1910s or the 1930s, or all the ones from the Midwest. And you can look at them in every which way. So please have a look at that website, and it's free. And if you really love them, well, we're going to have some great posters and books here. So you're more than welcome to get your own copy and bring some high-rises home. But you can also just take a look at the website or just come say hi to us. And we just want to thank you for coming out to hear us talk and to support the High Rises collection.